The border buoys will remain in the Rio Grande, at least for now. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals granted Texas Governor Greg Abbott a temporary victory on Friday, halting a federal judge's order just a day earlier that mandated the barriers be removed by this coming Friday. Abbott said in a statement Thursday that he is prepared to take this case all the way to the Supreme Court if needed. The buoys were installed back in July as part of Abbott's broader migrant deterrent efforts, also known as Operation Lone Star. The Justice Department then sued the state of Texas, alleging the buoys violated federal law and were installed without government authorization. Mexican officials have said the barrier violates their country's sovereignty. But let's put aside the legal and political implications here for a moment, because real people, migrants who are risking it all, risking their lives for a better life, they're the ones suffering the consequences. 2 bodies were found in the Rio Grande last month. One was found entangled in the buoys, and the other was found about 3 miles upriver, identified as a 20-year-old Honduran man. Now, these tragedies are far too common. As Debbie Nathan points out in The Intercept, during the last 3 fiscal years, more people have died trying to cross the border than at any other time in recorded U.S. immigration enforcement history. Joining me now to discuss this is Krish O'Mara Vignarajah, President and CEO of the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. She also served as a former policy director for Michelle Obama. It's great to have you back on the show, Krish. You've called Abbott's move to build this 1,000-foot string of buoys political grandstanding because, in fact, it's only a very small portion of the 1,200-mile-long border with Mexico. And now that we know the barrier will stay in place for the time being, what do you think the long-term ramifications are here?
As you know, it's deeply problematic when you think about the fact that this buoy barrier is only 0.01% of Texas's border. And that's why, as you said, I do think that this is just political grandstanding rather than a substantive policy initiative. But I think it's important to understand that this is only one piece of Governor Abbott's Lone Star initiative that has cost Texas taxpayers $4 billion. And in fact, the Texas legislature has now approved an additional $6 billion to undertake these inhumane efforts. It's not just, dead bodies that have shown up in the Rio Grande as a result of these problematic policies. It's a 4-year-old who, after being turned back by Texas authorities, ended up passing out of exhaustion as a result of the heat and no ability to get to water. So these are the inhumane conditions that Governor Abbott is creating. And I think rightfully the Department of Justice appealed and got a decision in court saying this violated federal law, it was ineffective, and it's really a problematic strategy.
If you look at the timing of when this happened, the buoys were installed in July, I guess, right after Title 42 was lifted in May. How much do you think this factored into the governor's decision to build this barrier, and what does this say about the need for comprehensive and humane immigration reform in this country? Because it doesn't seem there is any movement on the comprehensive reform side.
Sadly, no, there isn't any real movement on, and it's not just comprehensive immigration reform. We're not seeing any real steps on immigration reform, period. And that includes even things like economic visas at a time when inflation is obviously a massive, problem with the economy. It is in part because of a lack of immigration. Sadly, Governor Abbott's move in terms of implementing the buoys wasn't his only step, as I mentioned. He was, busing migrants to New York City and other locations as well. So I do think that it may have accelerated his actions, but I also think that you're seeing governors who are trying to one-up one another in implementing strategies to show how inhumane and draconian they can be. And that is the dynamic you're seeing between Texas and Florida. Instead of implementing real measures that are both the right thing to do for the country, but the smart thing to do for the country, because we need immigration.
Let's talk about the rhetoric here. The Justice Department has pushed back on the language that Greg Abbott has used, including the word invasion, which I guess he's using to try and justify his actions on the border with the creation of this barrier. You've said this kind of rhetoric actually gets people killed. Expand on that for us. Who is Abbott signaling to when he uses words like invasion to describe migrants coming across the border?
It's the audience that in extreme situations will actually take up arms in order to act against what they believe is immigrants coming into the country in an absolutely chaotic and unmanaged way. The reality is that we have immigration policies at the southern border. Even after Title 42, we have a policy called Title 8 that controls who can come in and out of the country. And so what it does, along with words like, white replacement theory, is it galvanizes and mobilizes people to act on their hatred, and that costs lives.
It's not only the long stretch of buoys, but the Texas law enforcement officials themselves. There was some reporting earlier this summer by the New York Times describing how officials have denied migrants water. They shouted at them to return to Mexico. When you have this level of cruelty, with the example being set by the governor himself, is it even possible to hold these officials accountable? And what does that accountability look like, besides for Greg Abbott at the ballot box when his term is up?
Well, when a governor, even a governor, is putting in place rogue cowboy policies, there has to be a rule of law that still governs our country, every single piece of it. And so I think it's important to understand there was a Department of Public Safety Texas employee who was a whistleblower who highlighted the inhumane policies and the humanitarian implications they were having. So I think this is where, whether it is the Department of Justice challenging the buoys or other measures, it's gotta, we have rules and we have, conditions that are impermissible in terms of what actions you can take against women, children, individuals. What we also saw by the Texas officials was essentially a de facto separation policy where Texas authorities would arrest males and then remove them from their families and have the women and children go into other facilities. And I think that this has to end. We saw in 2018, we're seeing it today. And I do think, just as we saw in 2018, the American public will stand up in outrage because these are not American policies. They're un-American and they're illegal.
You say the American public will stand up, and I totally get the totality of the country may be sympathetic to migrants coming into this country, but there was a poll that was published by the University of Texas on Friday that found there's a slim majority of folks who actually support Abbott's use of the buoys and barbed wire to deter migrants. I think 52%, there it is on the screen, support it. I'm curious to get your thoughts on what does this say about the broader narrative about migrants in this country? How do we change the feelings of fear and animosity towards them? And even in cities like New York, where there is a long history of welcoming migrants, you're now seeing officials like the mayor of New York City warn of the disaster that New York is facing as a result of this influx of migrants.
So when you work in immigration, you find that every day you're fighting fiction with fact. I think part of why you're seeing those poll results is because some Americans are turning into news outlets and all they're hearing is that immigrants are coming to the U.S., that they're crime perpetrating assailants who are coming here to rape and pillage. They're hearing that fentanyl and the opioid epidemic are spread as a result of migrant mules. And the truth is nothing could be farther from those suggestions. And so I think that's where we have to be vocal about who they are. They're people who are fleeing the most dire of circumstances, their children, their families. They're coming because America has been a beacon of hope. And I think making that case instead of just radio silence from one side is what we have to do. Because right now you see one side that's trying to make this a wedge issue, that's politicizing it, and the other side, in terms of our political leaders, are staying silent. And that's not a winning strategy.
All right, Krish O'Mara Vignarajah, thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate your insights on this very important conversation that we continue to have here. Coming up.